Hi, welcome to the GAI discussion series. I'm here with Commissioner Noah Phillips. How you doing, Noah?
I'm well, thanks, Josh. Great to be here with you.
Well,
How
I
are you?
I'm doing all right, as well as one can do. You know, uh, During these times, I'm not teaching this semester, so I am mostly spending time being sympathetic to my colleagues who are teaching online law school classes at the moment. How's life in the commission during the pandemic?
You know, for me, I think above everything, it's three little ones running around the house. Um, the funny thing about all of this is how much is still the same, right? Like people are still working, things are done remotely, but there's conference calls constantly. What's weird is, you can't talk to people in person. You can't walk down the hall and talk to your colleagues. For me, that's hard. I'm an extrovert. Um, but just trying to manage like all of the IT and just interpersonal relationships, mediated over the web.
Are you all this one of the big challenges for me when I got to the commission, and one I did not expect? Uh, Chairman Kovacic had written quite a bit about the impact of the Sunshine Act in terms of intercommissioner communications, and I had always, as an outsider, as an academic, thought, goodness, there are much bigger fish to fry. Why so much attention on the Sunshine Act, which then just prevented meetings that would constitute a quorum at the FTC. So you could talk to anybody one at a time for our listeners who are not familiar with the Sunshine Act, but never talk to, when you have a full slate of five commissioners, talk to two of your friends instead of one. About 6 months into my stint at the commission, I thought maybe this guy Kovacic was onto something in terms of the ability to talk to multiple people at once and being able to communicate with your colleagues. Have you found during this time much of a, I mean, you talking to them on the phone? Are you able to interact with, your own staff, of course, but what about the intercommissioner, sort of the collegiality part of the commission? Has that changed at all with this?
I don't know that it's changed with this. I do think it's worse because personal interaction is just better than over the phone. I mean, you mentioned the Sunshine Act. So, one of the weirdest moments of my early tenure was we were in our first House oversight hearing. And as you know, there have been over the years a lot of proposals, in particular from Republicans, to reform some of the processes at the agency, um, kind of good government stuff. And the political conversation surrounding the FTC has very much moved on. And it had moved on by the time of this hearing. But one of the members of the committee, I can't remember who it was, asked whether there were any process reforms that we needed uh, to make the agency a better place. And I blurted out, well, you should repeal the Sunshine Act. And he looked at me, this is a member of Congress, open hearing, and he says, why would I repeal the Sunshine Act? That sounds like a good thing. And I really appreciated, both the chairman and Commissioner Slaughter sort of raised their hands to speak up to explain. And I had a little back and forth with him that, no, I wasn't trying to hide anything. It was just
Right.
that this law, with all the best intentions, really impeded the back and forth communication. And I think it does. I think Kovacic was right. I think what you realized um, is also right. But I think right now the big difference is, I can't stroll down the hall and talk to someone, right? A little bit, there are phone calls and there are phone calls that happen without being calendared, but sometimes those don't work. And it's just for me, and I think for others too, it's a lot better when you can speak in person. So look, people are suffering in America. This is really hard, and it's really hard for the people lucky enough still to have jobs. But this is one of the many ways where the working conditions are suboptimal.
Well, I was all set. We are recording this on May the 6th. Happy belated Cinco de Mayo to you.
Like,
But I was recording this. We're recording this on the 6th, and I was all set. were sworn in as a commissioner on May 2nd, 2018, and so I was all set to ask you sort of, hey, 2 years down. Um, in my experience, I felt like at the 2 year mark, I was just sort of I had figured out how the place worked. I sort of had a sense about what I wanted to do in the third year. So it's all sort of set to ask you about how you felt like this first 2 years went, what's on tap for year three, and I'm still going to ask you that, and we can talk about it. Um, but last night, outcome a set of statements in the commission's approval with divestitures of the merger of AbbVie and Allergan. Um, at least as far as I can remember in the last couple of years, maybe the most, I don't know if heated is the right word, but I'm going to use it. A heated set of statements, at least strongly worded set of statements. The majority statement with the chairman and Commissioner Wilson and you, and a couple of dissents from Commissioners Slaughter and Chopra about the appropriateness of the consent in AbbVie-Allergan, disputes over facts and staff and the like, and just it sort of stood out to me as I read the statements last night that it was a bit more contentious than your average bear in terms of consent. So I figured we would start there. So for lack of better question, is that AbbVie-Allergan, what's going on?
Look, I think you're right to notice that these statements are strongly worded. To me, this is part of a broader set of conversations that we have been having as a commission that I think have been having had in terms of antitrust policy more broadly. This is not the second time that we have resolved competitive concerns with a very large pharmaceutical merger over stinging dissents. The last one was Bristol Myers Celgene. In that case, my view was, and I said this publicly, I understand that the dissenters do not like large pharmaceutical mergers. But what we do as antitrust enforcers is we think about the theories of harm that might occur, and then we look at the facts. And I think our duty, like our earnest duty, is to take all the facts that are in front of us, to look at them in light of the law, and to weigh those facts, not with our preferred outcome in mind, but do the facts support a theory of liability? And people will have different weighings of facts, and they'll have different views about what could constitute a theory of liability. But I don't think the fact that it is a pharmaceutical mega merger standing alone gives you an answer to the questions that we're supposed to ask. So, I kind of wrote that in Bristol Myers, and I think AbbVie-Allergan is very much kind of the second one of these. And I think what you see is some disappointment in a claim that a claim that the investigation was inadequate, that the processes are inadequate, where it happens to result in an outcome that people don't like. And I don't think that's a fair approach. Many tires were kicked. Many people were listened to. Many people were interviewed. And the facts are what they are. And people can take different views of the facts. But I don't think it's fair to say that, the process was broken.
In terms of 3-2 votes, this was one. You had another one in the pharma. I don't have the count in front of me, but it's I think during my 3 years we set a record for that during the 3 year stint with 3-2s, normally taking the form and or maybe the record was non-unanimous votes because there's a bunch of four ones too. But it seems like the clips of the different political environment too. I mean, a really different political environment. I don't think anyone's surprised these days to get three twos because you have views and the farmer mergers you're talking about are good examples, right? I mean, the majority sort of writing within the frame of Clayton Act Section 7 and whether a merger substantially lessens competition. And we start by looking at competitive overlaps and we think about how a transaction changes competitive rivalry. And that's sort of the analysis that Section 7 asks for. We're thinking about how the merger impacts competition between the merged parties. And the dissents, at least as I read them last night, um, are dissenting. At least my read is not so much because that analysis is necessarily done incorrectly, but because they would like a different form of analysis done, or maybe. And I think this is a fair characterization. But Commissioner Chopra will tell me if it's not. Maybe they're asking for analysis that's sort of outside of what we normally do in Section 7. Um, and so under those sorts of circumstances, you're going to get dissents, you're going to get lots of disagreement. That a fair characterization. I mean, that seems to be what's happening in quite a bit of these 3-2s is certainly some debate within the sort of more narrow stakes of we disagree on the facts on a Section 7 analysis, but a large dose of we ought to be doing something else. And that echoes kind of, I think, the landscape that we're seeing in antitrust more generally. We have hearings over whether we should, you know, overturn the consumer welfare standard, and we have Senate hearings on whether we should, change the statute or do something different, sort of big 30,000-foot questions. And I think a luxury I had in the commission, even with the disagreement we had, was we all sort of applied the same framework, and I think you're operating in a much different time, right? The framework is up for grabs, maybe more than it's been during either of our lifetimes, and I'm sort of feeling some of that come out, not just in these farmer dissents, but more generally. Does that sound right to you? Does it sound like I'm reading it incorrectly?
Um, I think a lot of what you said is absolutely correct, and let me come back to that in a moment. The one thing I'd add is this: one big back and forth that I think you see in AbbVie-Allergan is either the claim or the insinuation that certain questions weren't asked, and then the response, no, they were, but the facts didn't support the argument. So the one quibble I would have, you characterize how things are normally done versus, or how they've always been done versus how they might be done. There are times, right? And I feel like we see this a lot where people have theories of anti-competitive harm, but that's not enough. And this is what I wrote with as much emphasis as I can give in Bristol Myers. You look at documents and you talk to people and you analyze data. I'm sorry if you can hear the kids in the background. Even if you have a theory and even if you're really certain of the theory, it's not enough simply to do that. You got to go and prove a case. And even cases that seem pretty well predicated, right, then find themselves in front of judges. And judges don't necessarily care about what editorial has been written or what someone is saying on Twitter, or even what a congressperson writes in a letter. We get a lot of letters about a lot of things, and the letters, don't have a lot of facts in them, certainly not to support a case. I welcome the letters. I want to hear what people's concerns are. And if there's a concern that, no one has thought of, we should look into that. I think that's fair. But that doesn't mean it's supported by facts. And to me, that's a big distinction. In terms of, you were talking about like a lot of 3-2s. That's my feeling. I haven't done a statistical analysis of, your tenure or other tenures where there was some disagreement. To me, we are doing both antitrust and consumer protection at a really interesting time. There's just a lot of public focus on these issues. Um, and, I think that that's part of the dynamic here.
And my view, for what it's worth, I've always, I think I've said this in a writing a couple of times. If you look at, I do have data on 3 to 2s. May not shock you. Um, and if you look at non-unanimous votes over time or 3 to 2s either way, you basically get a U, where you've got this long flat part during the 10 years of sort of it falls during Potofsky, Muris, Kovacic, Majoris, and starts to come up with Leibowitz, and it's gone up since. And I was very fond when people would blame me for dissensus at the agency of saying, it started before me, so I'm the effect, not the cause. In any event, my view was always a large part of that story was exactly what you just said. We are in a really interesting time. It used to be the case, at least on the consumer protection side of the ledger, that 95% of what we did were fraud cases, and they'd be 5-0 votes. And I think one of the things that helps the commission stay as collegial of a place as it's been historically, and maybe compared to some of its sister agencies, has been you never have to wait too long until you're voting 5-0 with your colleagues on a matter. I mean, it's tomorrow you'll probably vote 5-0 in some fraud case, and all be on the same page. But one thing that has happened on the consumer protection side of the docket is there are harder cases now than there used to be, with trade-offs involving privacy and competition and the like. And so there's just more reasonable zone of disagreement on the law, on the economics, on the politics, etc. And so I think we're just in a time where that's not only a natural outcome, but healthy. I mean, it's what these agencies are meant to do.
Yes, I think that's fair. I do think dissents play a really important role, right, in highlighting issues. And I think, you've seen some movement in response to dissents. But the brick wall up against which we kind of ought to run is the law, right? And the notion that you need to prove a case. And so I think it's great, to have dissents. I think that's good. But I do think that one of the problems can sometimes be that expectations can get set that aren't in line with where the law is. I mean, there's been a lot of cases where a version of this has come up. And I just think that's important to keep in mind.
Agreed. Well, now I'm going to do the 2-year perspective stuff. I mean, we think we've touched on some of it, backed into some of it here already, but you've been a commissioner for 2 years, 2 years and 4 days, and
4 days.
in 4 days. But I thought it would be. Remember, for me, I felt like it really wasn't until 2 years in. Truth be told, on the consumer protection side of the house, I was learning consumer protection the first. It's still learning, but spending a lot of time in my first 2 years how things worked, and what the different set of debates were, and getting up to speed with the 900 different consumer protection statutes that we sort of enforce either through the FTC Act or separately. So 2 years in, 30,000 foot perspectives on what you thought it would be, interesting challenges from the first 2 years, things that looking back you're especially proud of or wish you would have done differently, and then we'll sort of do what's next for you too.
So what a time, right, to be at the Federal Trade Commission. To my mind, there there are many really interesting parts of the government. There are really many really important parts of the government, but I don't think I could pick an issue set that is more timely and interesting than the one we have. And that combines both the antitrust stuff about which we've been talking, but also the consumer protection stuff. I mean, I think that privacy, the consumer data privacy, is as hot, right, as present an issue as it has ever been. It's not the only time when it's been a big issue, but it's hard to think of a time where it's been more of an issue. I used to hang around Capitol Hill in my last job, and there were a few proposals, um, but it really only crested in the last maybe 2.5 years. No, 2.5 years probably underdo. It may last 3 years. So that's incredible. In terms of how it's felt, how I feel about it. Look, it's the privilege of a lifetime in two really important respects. And the first is much more important than the second. So, in terms of policy and law enforcement, um, for me at least, it's great to be able to be involved, right, in these important issues and to help push for like the public good. So there is, you know, cracking down on some pyramid scheme, you know, working with justice to get a fraudster in prison, um, demonstrating the agency's chops as a privacy regulator, right, at a time when there's a broad discussion about the efficacy of GDPR. Those are great things. I mean, it's good to push for what I view as the social good. It's great to, fighting robocalls, like have a piece in that fight, which is a good fight, is a wonderful thing. And as you know, they're really great people, so I love doing that too. Um, and sort of the smaller version of that is the opportunity personally, right, to be involved in the mix on policy. One of the things that I've tried to add to the conversation over the last 2 years, and I hope I've been somewhat effective, especially on privacy, is the notion of kind of trade-offs. Right? There's a lot of, in my view, essentialist talk about rights, um, and people speaking with a great deal of volume and a lot of strong words about the importance of something, and I think really missing a lot of the flip side of the argument. And I've tried to have that conversation with Congress in public, and I've tried to have that conversation in some of what I've written at that commission. And for me, that's a really important thing. And then the last thing that I would add, what I hope I've done well, and people can quibble with whether I have, is I've tried to make my decisions really in terms of the facts in front of me and the legal framework as I understand it. And that's a hard thing for me to do at a time where you've got a lot of people pushing you, a lot of really powerful people, people who have views about either what the law is or what the law ought to be, and that the law ought to be effectuated not in terms of what it is, but in terms of what it ought to be. And that makes my challenge harder. But I hope that I have kind of, proceeded like a pace, right? Been a steady in the world. That's been my goal, at least. So I hope I've achieved that.
Well, one of the places where that stands out to me in your first couple of years is, and I'm partial to dissent, so your dissent in 1-800-CONTACTS jumps out to me as sort of one of the kind of big markers in the first 2 years. And I mean, we won't talk a lot about the underlying substance. The case is still on appeal and all of that. So I won't ask you to do that beyond what you're comfortable with. But the case that, all right, fascinating Section 1 issues. I've written a piece with Halsinger and Jeff Manny on it, and anything that can get Halsinger and I to agree and write together must at least be semi-interesting. But a whole host of interesting economic and legal issues. A really interesting vote lineup. I mean, you had a a Republican chair joined with Dems to form a majority with another Republican, and all I think pretty interesting from watching on the outside. And now the thing sort of sits up on the Second Circuit. That, and we'll talk a little bit. I want to ask you some things about administrative litigation in a little bit. That case, for those watching who are not familiar, um, go read the commission opinion, including the dissents. Uh, but case sort of came up through the FTC's Part 3 litigation process, and the commission wrote an opinion now on appeal. Oral arguments, maybe a couple weeks or a month old now.
Sounds right.
I,
No, I feel because it was before
it was
the
before this.
shutdown.
No sense of time.
Yeah,
It's
so it must
allowed to
have
be
been.
timing things wrong during the pandemic. It was a month and a half ago.
What day is it today, Josh?
I don't know. So let me start asking you sort of narrowly about that. Now, that stands out to me as one of the, I mean, even a bigger contribution if the Second Circuit takes your view. But it certainly stands out to me as a sort of big moment during your first 2 years. You want to talk any about that?
Yeah. Well, as you noted, this is sort of sub judice before the Second Circuit, which means they get to grade the commission's homework and they get to grade my homework, and they will do what they will do. The to me, one of the animating things in that case, there were two sort of animating points. One was I always get very nervous about the tendency that I noticed really within weeks of my antitrust class, which was taught by Richard Craswell in law school. The tendency of courts or agencies to pick the playing field before the battle is fought, right, or before the game is played. And so I get really leery, and courts have blessed it to some extent, but I think they've taken a pretty narrow view of taking frameworks, right, like inherently suspect or quick look, and expanding them without at least the really difficult predication that I think the courts ask us to set. And then the other thing, right, is like IP loomed large in that case, and what role we should have in terms of judging the underlying merits of IP and how that links up with antitrust, which, as you know, is sort of a tension that runs in a lot of different places in a lot of different directions. But we'll see what happens. It was good to have that back and forth with my colleagues. It was good to be able to add to the conversation. For me, when I think back on 2 years, what looms largest? It's certainly my longest work product, but I like to think it's one of the best.
Let me ask you one more sort of backwards looking deal, and then let you talk about what happens for you and what the plan is for year 3. But one of the other kind of big ticket items during the last couple of years have been these hearings. There were 307 of them on all of the topics that covered all of the antitrust waterfront, with 1,004 witnesses and lots of record. There's a large record for you to review, and that covered basically everything under the sun, as the chairman promised. Sort of an open self-evaluation process, great and healthy for the agency. But I think one of the big questions that's out there for academic practitioners, consumers of antitrust sort of thinking and policy is, so what do we do with all of that? I know there's talk of doing reports or guidelines or something along the different sort of 14 or whatever different modules it was. Let me ask a sort of broader question, which is, I think there's large consensus agreement that self-evaluation during this sort of unique time where kind of everything's up for grabs, and these really interesting debates both on the consumer protection and competition side of the house, self-evaluation debate is great. Now we've had that. It continues obviously outside of the FTC hearings, and the FTC's been part of that. So what happens with that process, or at least what do you looking for to happen, be a satisfactory outcome for you from that process?
In a sense, I think what the hearings accomplished above all is, your sort of point of there's a record and it's public and it's out there. So I've found, for instance, if there's been like I've been preparing for a spring meeting, let's say, and it's on big data and antitrust, right? You've got a whole hearing on that, and you can go and you can read it. And anyone can do this, right? Whether they're practitioners, whether they're politicians, academics, what have you. There's a really good record that tees up. I mean, you were using a lot of big numbers before, but 1,000 different debates, right? I hope, it may be that we see more guidance. There are the vertical merger guidelines, which kind of come out of this, and it may be that we see more guidance in other areas. But I think right now, where we are as a result of the hearings is, I think it's a great resource. And I think you can look back to the Patofsky hearings and them as a resource and see kind of how conversations moved and what facts people are thinking about, right? It would be really interesting, although I wouldn't recommend it, to do them right now, right? Now, in this weird time where the world economy is on some level shut down and people are using technology in different ways and they're thinking about privacy in different ways. But the hearings are both a reflection of the conversation at that period historically, in particular, right, a real focus on the technology companies and their practices and the economics that surround them and so on. But it's not only a reflection, right? It's also sort of a much more comprehensive look at a lot of questions raised, which I think is helpful.
So 2 years down, we're in year three. Anything on your mind in terms of priorities for the upcoming year?
Yeah, I sort of hinted at two of these, and I can talk about, or at least touch on a third. For me, we are not out of a period of tremendous public focus on what we do as an agency. And I hope I am able to continue to kind of stay the course and that we all make decisions, based on the facts and the law. So that's thing number one. I'm cognizant of the fact that we have an election coming up. And so there may be a change in personnel, and that'll be really interesting to see how that shakes. The second thing is, continuing to add at least my 2 cents to a lot of different policy debates. I mean, I talked before about privacy and its trade-offs. I think that's really important. Lately, there's been a lot of back and forth on, like, should we ban all mergers? And to be clear for those listening, we're not just talking about mergers. We're talking about what may sound very big to someone like me, but actually not particularly large acquisitions of a small amount of stock in a company, things like that. We're going to have a lot of policy debates, and I think continuing to add to that. In terms of particulars, something I've called for us to look at in the past is Hart-Scott-Rodino and how it's functioning. One of the things that I very much believe is that government and law can do so much, but market forces can add. And market forces have their own way of determining outcomes. And I think we neglect that lesson at our peril. And I hear people who are concerned about, broadly speaking, competitiveness in the economy. I hear those concerns. But I think we'd be remiss if we didn't think about ways to allow the market, right, to force companies to be more competitive. And one of the ways is the market for corporate control. And you talked about this in third point, right? The impact that shareholders can have on how companies are managed. I think we want to let that work. And so looking at HSR and thinking about how might we facilitate that conversation better, I think is a really warranted conversation.
Let me take you back to that merger moratorium discussion, which is getting a lot of attention. I think there was a new letter that came from the House the other day, and some, rising support in some corners for that. You've been a vocal critic of those proposals, and I certainly agree with you. But why don't you spell out here a little bit for folks listening to us here about you know what's been proposed, and the reasons why you uh, take a dim view of those proposals.
Sure. So it probably makes sense to start with noting that there are like proposals of proposals. I don't think I've seen a bill, but a bunch of folks on Capitol Hill and elsewhere um, have called, they use different words, but basically to ban or to pause a lot of mergers and acquisitions, really all the mergers and acquisitions that get noticed to us. The lived experience of the antitrust agencies over all administrations, right, has been that the overwhelming bulk of things that get noticed to us aren't a problem. And in fact, a great deal of those are not even interesting, like not remotely interesting. I think we actually waste too much time looking at some of these little transactions. We're doing a study right now to see whether there are some transactions maybe we're missing that we ought to be looking at. That's a fair conversation too. But I bought 5% of some large conglomerate for my index fund, probably not going to be that competitively interesting. And proposals to ban all that throw the baby out with the bathwater, right? They take using language that is sometimes applied to anti-competitive transactions and they map it onto all transactions. And that's just too much because by definition, we're talking about a lot of things that are positive. What I'd also add is this is basically saying we ought to shut down these markets for purposes of the pandemic. And I'm not a great believer in shutting down markets. I think markets have an important role to play in good times and in bad times. And I think the final point, and I think this is really important, I don't think there's any evidence to support the policy proposals link to the sort of predicate, right? I don't think that what we are seeing in the data, what we are seeing in the news reporting, suggests any reason for heightened concern. In fact, to me, pretty clear right now, it's the opposite. And what do I mean? So the claim is that the financial crisis will lead to like a wave of mergers where, and people talk about large companies or private equity firms. It's not really clear to me why private equity in and of itself as a concept is here. You've got 1.5 trillion or something in private equity capital lying around. I would like to see that capital go to work.
Right.
Just like I would like to see all sorts of capital go to work right now, doing all the things that we need and hiring the people and making the plants run and so forth. Keeping capital from working is something that might be warranted if you're thinking about, does a bank have adequate capital to resist a downturn, right? That was something we thought about and talked about in the context of the last financial crisis. But the notion of keeping all the capital, whether any systemic risk from working, I think is a problematic thing. The bottom line is right now M&A is down, right? Anyone who reads the front page of the Wall Street Journal now knows that what we're talking about now is materially adverse event clauses, right? People are pulling out of their deals, and that's private equity firms and large companies. And what are we seeing in the data? A dramatic drop in M&A. What did we see in the last crisis? A dramatic drop in M&A. I think we should continue to police deals, right? If we see if we see anti-competitive transactions, we should stop those. But the notion that we should bar all deals and the notion that the crisis, which is forcing deals to get cut off, is a reason to stop them. To me, it doesn't cohere. Like, we're back up online. People are working hard. There's less input. But why that means you need to stop everything, like to me, that doesn't even follow logically.
I certainly agree. It doesn't. I mean, I will. I will not ask you a question about this, but I will certainly share my cynical view that the objection is a little bit of a thou dost protest too much going on here that reveals what seems to be an attempt to sort of dress up um, a competition policy agenda item to prohibit mergers and change antitrust policy and sort of dress it up in the crisis a bit when the theory that the crisis is putting the agencies sort of under too great a burden is certainly not, as a point you've made over and over, certainly not borne out by the facts with a big dip in M&A. I mean, they agency staff are just fine in terms of reviewing deals. I think it's pretty clear the antitrust agencies are committed to enforcing deals. They're um, whether it is in court or an agency review, or I mean, just the other day, your sister agency, the textbook merger got abandoned. I mean, no, nobody ever counts those as wins for the agencies in terms of agency review, but it looks like the agencies are hard at work, as one might expect during this period, and um, certainly doesn't seem to be a case that they need help with the while M&A is down, handling, sort of triaging deals that come in. And I think it's a unfortunate policy discussion to be having because you said it sort of obfuscates. There are really important things to do in HSR. We have sort of type 1 and type 2 error, both that are costly to the system. We spend too much time on trivial deals, and maybe we miss some anti-competitive deals. And I think both of those are things that are part of HSR. Any serious attempt to do HSR reform, and a call to ban all deals isn't just, and now my words, not yours, isn't just not serious. It's probably pretty darn harmful to the economy, to consumers, to competition as well. That was my soapboxing, but my 2 cents on the same.
Yeah, look, if people want to have a debate about whether we should allow mergers and acquisitions in the American economy, period, fine. I'm happy to have that debate. I don't think it's a particularly hard one, but I'm happy to have it. Um, so I think it's bad policy, but I certainly also think that it's an odd time because it's the opposite of what we're seeing. I mean, again, look, we may see companies that have a lot of assets buying up companies that are failing as a result of crisis. That is absolutely a plausible scenario. But right now, merger wave does not describe what we are seeing. What we are seeing is a dramatic decline. And that is like every day you read about this in the business press, in the mainstream press, like deal after deal, like just pick Deal Book or the Journal, whatever. The story is a decline. And that's exactly what we saw in the last financial crisis, and it's exactly what you'd expect. Occasionally, someone will say, well, the banks consolidated. Well, okay, first of all, the banks failed dramatically. Second of all, the government forced them to consolidate. And third of all, we adopted a major regulatory burden that that basically advantaged the large banks over the little one. And you can quibble about that, and you can think it was warranted, you can think it's not. We can have that debate separately. But like, if this debate is just about should we allow M&A in America, fine, let's have it. But it certainly doesn't seem to be about the facts that we're seeing right now, the facts on the ground.
So I've kept you longer than I said I was going to keep you, but you have time for 2 more quick ones before we go get the rest of our morning coffee and continue with you continue to protect consumers and competition, and I'll find something to do. So 2 things on my mind, and I'll sort of tee them up because they almost they're related in my mind in a way. And one is administrative litigation, and the other is Section 5 unfair methods of competition, which is more or less always on my mind. So administrative litigation, one piece. So the FTC lost its PI hearing in Evonik in federal court, and we'll have in one of these GAI online discussion series, I think we're going to have some folks talking about the case. And so I will not steal their thunder and ask you to talk too much about the underlying merits there. We'll sort of let them do that. But the FTC loses that thing. They win a lot of cases. They win a lot more than they lose, but occasionally the agency takes some losses. That's one. But what caught my eye was not so much that the underlying merits of the decision or the judge's opinion, but the vote to close the Part 3 proceeding, which is sort of normal course for the agency after losing the PI in federal court, went 3-2. And when this happened, I think there's a lot of discussion in the antitrust bar and community about what the heck that meant. In a sort of normal form, you lose the PI. There's usually a unanimous vote to close the Part 3 proceeding, and this triggers concerns for people about whether it is controversial not to close Part 3. The history that led us to the Smarter Act and various calls to reform the agency's ability to use administrative litigation to stop mergers, as the agency went through this time period where we were arguing in federal court that we have a different PI standard than does justice, and that if we lose in federal court, by the way, predecessor of my seat, Commissioner Rush, is very fond of saying, well, we're going to sue you in Part 3 anyway. We did that in a couple of deals, and I think the bar, the public, Congress reacted to that by saying, you're going to do what exactly? And sort of lots of problems, the due process and so forth, that got us sort of discussion over the Smarter Act and administrative litigation reform. That 3-2, I think, while it did not come with statements from the commissioners, I think it sort of sparked up some of that discussion. So I won't ask you specifically about Evonik, but about how you see, we talked a little bit about administrative litigation in the context of when I did contacts. But lots of talk now about institutional reform, and one of these big FTC hearing questions is, we've got these two different procedures, and the FTC has access to administrative litigation, and in mergers that might be a big deal because of clearance. We might have, effectively different standards in different agencies, and that gives folks concern. So let me use that Evonik 3-2 as a way to get your thoughts on administrative litigation, in particular with respect to merger review.
Sure. Let me say a few things. So first of all, having two different standards doesn't make a lot of sense. I was very fond of the line of questioning that the chairman and the assistant attorney general for antitrust, Megan Delrahim, got in a Senate hearing last year when they were asked sort of, if you were starting anew, would you have two agencies? And then the consensus seemed to be like, well, maybe not. But certainly having a different legal standard based on, where you end up falling doesn't make a lot of sense. I think the agency has long taken the position that if we lose in federal court, we're not going to go back and redo the work in Part 3. I think that's the right position to take. I also think if we were to start doing that, right, all of the academic work that you've done showing that the agency, right, the staff whose case is voted out by the commissioners, like they may lose in front of the administrative law judge, but they almost never lose in front of the commission that voted out the case in the first instance. If you had a concern based on those statistics, and then we added to the concern reviewing the decisions of federal judges in a court that we control, where the only remedy at the end of the day is an appeal to an appellate court, which will be decided in 2 or 3 years, I think those concerns are accentuated. I think that's a really problematic standard to set.
Agree, and look, in this particular case, the no votes don't come with written statements, but I certainly think it's how many in the antitrust community will read it. It's a no vote on closing an administrative proceeding after a loss in federal court. we amended the rules not too long ago to make a statement that we weren't going to do that. Long been, since Chairman Potofsky, long been agency policy. But I think this is sort of cause for, while we're in the middle of these institutional reform discussions, certainly is going to kick up some of those discussions around why is it that we have the option to do that and the sister agency doesn't. Um, Along the other sort of many other lines of institutional reform questions that are out there ready to be had.
To me, the most important, or one of the most important takeaways is at a time when a lot of people want to give antitrust authorities a lot of power, I think it's incumbent upon us to demonstrate that we can exercise that power in a level-headed way.
Well,
And
go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think, federal judges sometimes get things right. Federal judges sometimes get things wrong. They're federal judges.
Well, exercising power in a responsible way is a great segue to Section 5 in the UMC statement. So let me use that. So that was one of the primary reasons, when I would go out and make the case for the Section 5 statement. It was really two parts. It was the substantive part that unfair methods hadn't been defined in 100 years, and we've got agency guidelines on basically everything. Here we've got this signature, special, unique authority. We're just not going to tell you what it is. It's whatever three commissioners say it is at any given time, and the commissioners come and go, and you can come up with a list of what unfair methods have meant over time. So you've got this sort of substantive part where I thought, frankly, was having a negative impact on our ability to use it to bring cases. The second companies under investigation would, we would investigate an antitrust claim. They would say, well, sue me. We don't think we violated the antitrust law. And the agency would say, yeah, but maybe you violated Section 5. And we'd get a settlement, and that's that. But we wouldn't use Section 5 to litigate because the agency, because we were afraid a court would define it instead of us. So we had sort of it was a settlement tool, and it was a really effective one because it evaded all sorts of notions of, at least in my view, evaded all sorts of notions of what we'd expect out of normal due process. But we had the substantive issue that it was 100 years without definition, but these huge administrative advantages, because what we were going to do was bring you into Part 3 with a Section 5 unfair methods claim. And the statistics said the agency was going to win. You would flip a coin in front of the ALJ, but ultimately you would see commissioners, and you may not win all your claims, but you're going to win your case, your UMC case, and maybe you can get judicial review 2 or 3 years later. And lo and behold, companies sort of do a cost-benefit analysis with that and say, we'll settle today. And the agency sort of waves around a press release. And my view was, goodness, we have not shown ourselves in that particular dimension to be responsible stewards of that Section 5 UMC power. Let's write down how we're gonna use it. And ultimately, we did that. It's now been almost 5 years since that statement. And I've seen the statement come up in a handful of dissents, some discussion about rulemaking, a little bit during the hearings about whether we might do more or less with it. My own view is, my feeling was that the need for the statement was both to help the agency enforce a positive agenda, where there are cases that we sort of think fit this band of actually sort of harming consumer welfare, but outside the scope of the antitrust laws in some way and would otherwise satisfy a rule of reason concern. This will enable us to wave around the statement in federal court like we do other forms of guidelines to say, Your Honor, this is how we think about this problem, and this is how you should too, because we weren't doing that. We would not litigate a UMC case without a statement. We never did. We didn't for 50 years. And I think the statement helps us do it. So it's to help us do that, but also to keep us away from some of the abuses, right? From some of the abuses either in the administrative process or substantively. So 5 years later, shows up. I guess there's a UMC claim in the Qualcomm litigation, or at least there was. Um, Still doing invitations to collude. But my view is that the statement's largely done its job. I don't know. I've seen a little bit of a talk. Commissioner Chopra raised some pretty interesting issues in the rent-to-own settlements about interlocking directorates and sort of gaps in statutes as a possible sort of Section 5 UMC claim, and made some statements that maybe the majority should have included some UMC claims there. But your sense of the Section 5 UMC landscape, a little talk in the hearings about whether more or less needs to be done there, or whether, sort of more restrictions, less restrictions, doing its job, not doing its job. Do you have a sense of that landscape generally?
Yeah, I mean, my sense is, credit to you, I think the statement is helpful. Uh, there are kind of two interesting variants on the conversation that I think you all were having at the time, and that the agency has been having for a very long time, about what the scope of the law is. The two variants that are interesting to me that have come up lately are, first, where Section 5 fits in the context not of the broader language of the Sherman Act, but in terms of more specific statutes. So you talked about interlocking directorates, Section 8 under the Clayton Act, where Congress speaks more specifically to an issue. They don't just say something like, restraint of trade, which even the courts had to add unreasonable. What role does Section 5 have? Because I think there's a robust debate to be had if Congress is more specific, whether the statute just allows us to create new law. The other really interesting part of this debate is, of course, this issue that has come up that Commissioner Chopra has raised about rulemaking. It's one thing to bring a case. It's quite another to make a rule for the economy. And if you think, and I'm not saying he does, but if you think that there is functionally no limit to the scope of a statute, if everything can be an unfair method of competition, then a rulemaking raises, I think, like constitutional questions. Did Congress really intend us to write any statute we want with respect to how a market economy works? The answer to that has got to be no. And that raises issues of statutory interpretation, and it raises issues beyond that. But to me, that is a very scary prospect, the notion of unbounded rulemaking power over the economy.
I certainly, at the time of the debate over the statement internally, constraints on competition rulemaking was not part of that discussion, although
I think the statement even says case by case.
It says case by case in terms of when it describes the rule of reason authority. Although I cannot say that I am unpleased at the. It's funny, the reaction I got. One of the biggest pushbacks on the statement, even from those who were sort of inclined to agree that it would be a good thing to define Section 5, and agreed some of the administrative process problems were significant, was I would hear, Josh, the first prong is about doing consumer welfare, and we all do that. There's no debate over that. Of course we do the consumer welfare standard. It's not even worth putting in there. It shows how trivial the statement is that we're including as the first prong that an unfair method must sort of violate the consumer welfare standard. And this was before, neo-Brandeisian hipster antitrust sort of attacks on the consumer welfare standard really took center stage. And I think a sort of a variant of that line has been through, Lena, Khan, and Rohit have this article in the Chicago Law Review making the case for competition rulemaking along the same lines. sort of my view now that a really nice, totally unintended benefit. I wish I could take credit for it, along with um, my other three colleagues who signed the statement. Um, is that I do think that it at least imposes some constraint on the rulemaking process, because it defines unfair methods of competition in the way it does, at least sort of tethers them to the consumer welfare standard. I, I am imagining if the agency sort of follows the rulemaking path, that we're going to find ourselves a little bit like the FCC, where we're gonna end up in long litigation about these rules, uh, and whether the statement constrains that rulemaking authority will be, or at least limits it in some way, will be an important part of that eventual litigation, or those disputes. But certainly not a planned benefit of the statement at the time. Well, I've kept you now way longer than I promised, and we're probably both overdue to refresh our coffees. So, um, anything you want to close with, or say before we go?
No, I just close with this. To those watching, I hope people are well and weathering the storm. This is a hard time. But thank you, Josh, for having me. This was fun. And I look forward to doing something in person in public, hopefully in the not too distant future.
Me too. Thanks for coming on. We really appreciate it, and stay safe.
You too. Stay safe. Bye bye.